My name is Rachit, and it's a delight speaking to you today on this topic. I work for a company called Merkle, and we are a consulting company in the space of customer experience. The kind of work we do has to do with marketing, customer data, prediction models, profiles, some of the tools from big platforms like Google and Facebook and Adobe and Salesforce, and how we use that in organizations. And so when I speak about this, I try to dip into all of the issues that I get exposed to daily, because we do capture a lot of data and we're responsible for processing and managing that information across different geographies and different regulations and laws. And data still has some guardrails around management, but the processing of it with machine learning, training algorithms, that's Wild West. And we get fairly open-ended questions with no clear guidance on how to pursue this. So I'm going to dip into that experience. I'm also going to dip into a few other experiences. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am. My name is Rachit, and I'm going to I'm going to wear a few different hats as I talk about AI today. And the first hat is that of a data geek. I studied computer science way back in university, and I've kept in touch in my area of marketing and customer experience. I've always been the guy that worked on the analytics models, that worked on the predictive models, that took them out to the real world and did use cases and saw if it worked or if it annoyed customers, or if we violated some laws. A lot of tricky questions around using all that information. And so there's a marketer part of my brain. And what I'm really excited to talk about today is marketing was one of the earliest applications of AI. And I'll maybe take you back in time a little bit to maybe how exciting things were 15 years ago, and the kind of ups and downs that we've been through in my industry as AI tends towards maturity, and the kind of challenges we run into and the self-reflection required to recover from those. And that's really fun to watch. And the last hat that I'll wear is that of an entrepreneur. I started a business and I ran it for 15 years. And before I sold it to Merkle, which is where I work now. But as part of that, I grew a team across multiple geographies. I worried about attracting the right gender, the right age group, the right racial mix of people. I worried about, pay and compensation and time off and mental health. And as a boss, a lot of what we want our algorithms to do, I spent nights worrying about it and trying to build a team. And so that's another thing that's guided me through my discovery in this area of AI. Um, so let's talk a little bit about AI. My exposure to AI in the early days was it's a wonder tool. AI can do amazing things. For example, many of you today might have not written the emails that went out from your inbox. You just kind of waited for Google to autofill it for you, and then you fixed a few things or deleted a few paragraphs. But you took an extra 30 seconds to have somebody else write a note or a response for you. And thanks to AI, this can happen. There are suggestions on your phone, and there are actual an ability in your inbox in your browser for somebody to write this for you. In my industry, things like copywriting now happen with AI. We feed it a lot of context and we feed it test articles, and it tries to guess and come up with content on its own. So, we enjoy consumer benefits of this. There are also deeper sort of societal benefits to this. For example, if any of you use a smartwatch, you might have seen this feature, which is designed to help folks who maybe take a fall and can't call for help. These watches tend to auto detect that and then send an SOS message to people you care about. Now, there isn't enough data in your watch to actually guess what a fall is. Like, the fall is not very different than a jump or a dip. But thanks to AI training models and a lot of information that was fed to the Apple algorithms in the back end, they have learned to differentiate between a fall and a sit down and when it becomes dangerous. And so, in areas like elder care, or in areas like city design, AI is doing some amazing, wonderful things. So we all like to promise, but that's not why we're here. We're here today to talk about the Terminator situation. What happens when it goes rogue and there's a drone floating over our head. So I come from a world where that's kind of happened, and I'll take you back in time. I come from the world of marketing and advertising, and if you see on your screen that the thing on the left is the Amazon auto suggestion. And I don't know about you guys, but I know I was blown away the first time I browsed an Amazon product and I read the stuff that was right below it. And I was like, how? Take my money. This is great guesswork. I don't know how you're doing this. I felt exactly the same way when the first time I used Google, the search engine, after Alta Vista and Lycos and Excite, when suddenly you type something and it seemed to know what to tell you. And it wasn't Viagra and it wasn't porn and it wasn't crappy sites. It was real information that came up in time. And over time, companies like Google extended that to advertising. And as an advertiser, in 2005 to 2010, I remember getting hyped up when all of these features that were long in development finally became usable products, where I could do something like upload a customer list onto Google systems, and then Google would find some attributes with all those folks, and it would go out into its entire universe of users to try to find me more potential users. Right? That sort of matching from a tiny little audience set to the entire world where they could find customers was amazing. Similarly, if you used a Facebook algorithm in the early days, just in the sweet spot, before all the Farmville requests came in, I'm sure you were also delighted by what showed up in your feed, long lost friends and a niece or a nephew that you hadn't seen for a while, or a joke that you didn't know you needed at that time, just popping up in that feed. So these tech firms, they did some amazing stuff with AI. As you can guess, though, AI is just a form of high tech adoption, and high tech adoption tends to follow patterns. And many of you might have seen this graph. It was made famous by a guy named Christian Claytonson, and it's called in a book called "Crossing the Chasm." And what tends to happen with tech adoption is there is a very long development cycle. The product or service first goes out to innovators and early adopters, um, and then it suddenly crosses and leapfrogs into early majority and late majority, which is a huge drag on systems because suddenly a lot of users come on. And if you think back to something like Amazon or something like Google or something like Facebook, and you think about their growth, you will see that it almost perfectly matches a pattern like this. A lot of them have not yet gotten through the majority. They're expanding globally and they're getting out to new locations, and that's kind of helping train their systems. But you would also see that along with this growth in curve, problems start to emerge. The most famous problem that I'm sure we all related to was in politics, where in the US and the UK in the same year of 2016, thanks to social media and the kind of information that got amplified to different users, it really shifted the direction of the country. We had a new president in the US. The UK made a big decision, which, arguably the kind of information that was propagated by these algorithms and this AI might have tilted the edge. And so, real tangible difference in how the world works. And you can bet that the folks at Facebook did not know when they were designing the system that this would be a problem. You can bet that the folks at Google, when they designed the search engine and the advertising systems, they did not realize how creepy it would be for their AI to know exactly what our interests are, what we like to do, what we don't like to do, right? So these questions in my industry have been faced, and we've been through a different kind of cycle. A cycle where we were the advocates for new technology and its adoption. We were cheerleaders and profiteers from when the growth happened, and we were kind of losers when the crash happened. And ethically and morally, we were kind of forced to look inward and see, do we continue down this path? What do we do with the lines that have been crossed? And unfortunately, what happens is once lines get crossed, it takes very long to crawl back. Facebook has been trying for 4 years now, since Trump got elected, to try to find some level of fairness in its algorithms as it propagates information. And it's got two halves of that country to respond to, and an entire world which responds to its algorithms. And it struggled because the genie's out of the box. The algos have been built. A lot of the algorithms and the machine learning was not transparent. They might not even have known how things get selected because it wasn't a clear set of rules. It was determined and it was applied, and now they have to try to go back and bring it in. So today, what I'll talk about is not really the nightmare scenario. Um, I'm not going to talk about the Terminator scenario. I think we're quite far away from that. Our problems today are quite mundane and very observable, and things we can act on. And you can see that leaders around the world, even controversial ones like Elon Musk, are somewhat afraid of where AI could grow, right? But I think, to be frank, those of us on this group are maybe a decade or decade and a half behind Elon Musk. He sees a lot more running OpenAI than we do. And so I'll hopefully get to wrap up with some takeaways and lessons for me for how I can contribute to a better, more ethical, more equitable AI structure, right? Um, so AI has a lot of promise, but it has also been breaking at the seams. Let me give you some examples which are public, and I'll try to pull out some articles. So here's an article from 2.5 years ago in the New York Times. The article title is Facial Recognition is Accurate if you're a white guy, right? And some of you might have read this. And what happened with the early facial recognition systems was that they were far better at recognizing males. They were far better at recognizing folks from Western countries than they were of recognizing people of color, and particularly women of color. All of which seems unfair and equitable. But if you extend the learnings from facial recognition, that same facial recognition is also used in self-driving systems. So those same cars have to, in real time, try to judge from their cameras who's in front and can I recognize this as a person or an animal or an object. And suddenly now when you think about it and you see that this system is significantly weaker in recognizing a person of color, that will actually lead to life and death situations because the algorithm wasn't trained to recognize certain people on the road. And so it can't brake in time, it can't act on time, right? So little changes or little problems like this can have a butterfly effect and significantly expand into real world problems, which will be very regrettable for all of us. Another somewhat famous case in the industry was from Amazon. Amazon had an AI recruiting tool, which would browse through resumes and a lot of sites that they work with. They would try to shortlist the candidates that they thought would meet their requirement of talent and passion and compensation and long-term vision, and try to select that pool and push them through. The problem, it turned out, was they were relying on historical data for the training. And you know what happened historically? Men were preferred over women. And so the algorithm implicitly learned bias, and it tended to prefer male candidates of a certain age group over what we'd argue, were equally talented, if not more, women, people of color. So all the biases that human HR had in the decades past got translated into the algorithm because that was the test data that was given to them. And if you get a chance, read this one from UNESCO. They have a whole section on artificial intelligence, and they have a whole bunch of thought pieces on gender bias. And I'll share some personal stories of a startup that I'm working with and how we're struggling with something along this line in terms of gender and regional and racial equality. And I'll make it real. So I am a donor and an advisor at a startup called Solve Education. And what this company does, it helps education in developing countries like in Southeast Asia, in India, in Africa, by building games and bots. So that maybe somebody in a village who doesn't quite have access to a full PC and a learning suite can just use their phone to chat with a bot, practice their English, speak to them, hear back how pronunciation should be like. And In this, we use a lot of systems from the big tech companies. So we use a Google Cloud system for text to speech. Now, a big area of focus for us is actually in Africa, right? So we operate in a big way in Indonesia, in India, and in Nigeria, which is a major country for us. We were trying to get youth educated. Now, one challenge when we try to teach someone English is we need to tell them what the right pronunciation of a word is. And when they repeat it back to us, we need to judge if they're saying it right and give them feedback. Now, here's the problem. Google Cloud has supports 40 languages and 220 accents, but there is no English accent in Africa. So you have Western accents from the US, from UK, even some European countries. You have Indian accents because there's a lot of Indian engineers in Google, and they found the bandwidth to populate that data set. But there are no auto voice available for Africa. And so, despite our mission to try to take it to Indonesia, what we end up teaching those folks is not the accent that's acceptable in their small town in Indonesia or Nigeria. We have to borrow an accent from somewhere else in the world. And these folks are not most likely going to travel to another country to work. They need to be suitable and employable in the markets that they operate in. And so we're all dependent. No matter what system you're building, you're probably dipping into something from Amazon, something from Google, something from Microsoft, because the cloud and the data center power and the tools that are provided from these guys are the bedrock of building any sort of data analytics, prediction, machine learning model. And there is a lot of failure on this. This is a Gartner article from 2 years ago, which pointed out that in the next 3 years, which is including this year and next year, 85% of AI use cases would fail. Only 15% of use cases developed in the corporate world would actually be successful. And these are use cases involving facial recognition, IoT environments. So why is that? Why is it so hard to get AI right? And what can we kind of do about it? I'll point you to a couple of helpful resources. Stanford has an encyclopedia of philosophy. I'm sure if you just Google ethics AI, you'll run on this, and there's a course there. And they list out a bunch of debate topics that one should discuss when thinking about AI model planning. And in a more readable format, companies like Google and Microsoft have their policies clearly laid out. And they are exactly what you'd expect. You'd expect that the principles behind this AI should be developed to be human-centered. We definitely do not want the Terminator situation. AI should definitely learn from the best of us in terms of fairness and inclusiveness. AI should recognize that our sense of privacy and personal space, which is arguably a Western concept, is still very important. And as we mature, the whole world is going to require guarantees that privacy is not violated and security is not violated. And these applications can't cause bodily harm, for example, right? AI should absolutely be accountable to humans. As we build different AI systems that plug into each other, it's very conceivable that we run into a situation where an algorithm starts deciding things for us. For example, where to drive your car, or how much electricity to power into your house, or which students in a class should be called into a first batch and second batch. And these systems are useful, but without human accountability, there will be no way to go back and fix things when there is a bug. And we need to devote the human resources to make sure the systems are not opaque. They are transparent. Even though it's doing very smart work, in the end, it can extract out those principles or those logic or algorithms out into an understandable way. So these principles, by and large, I think we would understand, but there's a lot of them. I'm personally, while I'm a geek, I'm not a deep AI coder. I can somewhat understand what these APIs mean. And so as a marketer, one thing we're very good at is dumbing things down for ourselves. And so I've done that for me. And here are a couple of principles that I kind of follow to try to make sense and keep abreast of this world. So the first principle which I hope you guys can maybe take away, is there are now some very good frameworks when it comes to sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. I'm sure many of you hear the phrase DEI in your organization all the time. You're probably working on initiatives. You might be, if you're doing well, you might already be proudly counting some change in your organization and your ecosystems from it. But the problem is the people who develop the tech systems are not the leaders who typically care about these things. These end up being boardroom discussions or press discussions or discussions in meetings like this, but often not discussions when it comes to tech developers who are finding new technologies, who are bouncing off each other on how to build something or discuss use cases. And so, not just your exposure, but on the DEI concepts and the sustainable development goals that UN has laid out, you need to expose your entire organization to this, particularly the people that you might not normally speak to. You might only call them when there are tech problems. But in this case, it'll be too late to expose them to this stuff by the time a problem comes out. So be the evangelist and messenger to the deepest ends of your organization. Not everybody needs to be an expert on it, but everybody does need to just have the frameworks down. The second thing you can do is you might be working on machine learning applications, or you might be working on a couple of steps before that. Like a few steps before machine learning is data capture and data processing and the starter versions of predictions that probably use some simple built-in logic or very simple machine learning. So before you get to deep mind and AI, there is the early stages of just data interpretation, analysis, and basic prediction. And what you can do, whether you're in finance or HR or commercial systems or marketing, like I am, you could ask to see what data sets we use to make our decisions and watch for biases there. Now, a common way which I would normally do that is whatever, let's say my team is building out some campaigns to try to acquire new users or do education campaigns for our existing users. What I would do is I would artificially add new use cases to those projects. So I would say, what happens when we go out to a set of newly employed professionals in South Africa? What happens if we are trying to reach out to people who are in between jobs in Indonesia? So as you add more extreme use cases to the situations that you're exposed to, that will force the developers of those systems, campaigns, data to automatically watch for bias. And that's the key thing. The systems can follow thereafter, but the people need to be observing the bias, and that will help save a lot of problems later on. And the third thing, which I'm an advocate for in my circle, is that Gartner piece that only 15% of things succeed. In most applications, this is the very, very, very early adoption set of AI. And so it will take a long time for the products to feel right and work right. And if we rush to market, those problems will magnify and grow drastically over the coming years. So advocate for patience. Advocate for it's okay to fail, learn our lessons, collect customer feedback or user feedback, and then do another iteration and another iteration. Because if you look at the financial impact of what we're trying to achieve with AI, we're trying to build systems that will basically run your organization or business for decades afterwards. So it's okay for the development to take a decade before. But quarterly targets and annual targets and monthly numbers, those KPIs will tend to push development of programs in a direction which optimizes for the wrong thing. It wouldn't optimize for avoiding bias or achieving transparency or gaining equity. It will optimize for the shortest path to get to commercial success. And that, you can bet, is how Facebook and Google got into the trouble they did once the public market started breathing down. So hopefully that's a useful dumbed down version of how to live in this AI world. I'm going to pause here and say we can take some questions if people have.